Good evening, all. Welcome. This is one of the, as you've heard me say before at these events, one of the great events in the life of a college. We celebrate the pinnacle of academic and intellectual accomplishment among our faculty. And tonight, we are pleased to participate in and listen to and engage in the Barry N. Wish Professor of Government and Social Studies inaugural lecture. This was a professorship created in 1999 by Barry Wish, a member of class of '63, and the namesake of the experimental Black Box Wish Theater in Memorial Hall that he and his wife, Oblio, made possible through a very generous gift. Barry was first an overseer and then a trustee of the college from '89 to 2005, and he's been an amazing supporter of the college in so many ways over so many years, providing, in addition to the Wish Theater and this professorship, financial aid for many generations of Bowdoin students. Now, our speaker, our honoree, our new chairholder tonight is Professor Paul Franco. Paul is widely admired on our campus and well beyond for his teaching, his scholarship, his mentorship, his writing, his collegiality, his Labrador retrievers. And it is my great privilege to introduce him tonight. And not for nothing, but Paul was on the search committee 7 years ago that brought me here, so if you have any complaints, you really need to talk to Paul about that. He came to Bowdoin in 1990 from the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD and then taught as a William Rainey Harper Fellow. Before that, he had received his master's from the London School of Economics, and then before that, at one of the great liberal arts colleges, he received his bachelor's from Colorado College. His experience as a student in that small liberal arts college environment informed very much the way he teaches here at Bowdoin, and in particular, his extraordinary commitment to his students, many of whom are here tonight. I understand there's extra credit given to all of you for what will come tonight. It is hardly surprising that back in 2007, when he was a junior member of the faculty, he was voted by the Bowdoin senior class to give the annual Karofsky Lecture, which was based on his teaching ability and his influence on students. He's maintained this commitment to student engagement while at the same time pursuing and publishing influential scholarship in the fields of political philosophy and contemporary political theory. He is one of the foremost scholars of on the 20th century political philosopher Michael Oakeshott. And Paul has written 5 books, taking deep dives into the political theory of Oakeshott, as well as Hegel, Rousseau, and Nietzsche. He very recently published a book called Rousseau, Nietzsche, and the Image of the Human, which I suspect he will touch on in his talk tonight. He's published widely on modern topics in political theory and ethics in journals such as the American Political Science Review and the Journal of Politics. In short, Paul, you were a role model in your engagement with our students, your commitment to their learning, and in the scholarship that you provide. And we are honored to hear your inaugural speech as our new Barry N. Wish Professor of Government and Social Studies. Please give a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Clayton. I'm only hoping that people don't notice the yawning gap between the person you described and the person who's about to give this lecture. I also want to thank Barry Wish. I don't know him, but I've heard great things about Barry Wish. And, you know, we often forget just what an amazing thing it is that alums from Bowdoin donate often considerable sums of money to support our research and our teaching. And they often do it without strings attached and because they really believe in what we're doing here. And I think we owe them to strive every day to be worthy of that faith and that trust. There's so many people I'm looking at. I know, I feel like I know everybody here, and I could spend a long time thanking many of you. I'm not going to, just because I don't want this to turn into Academy Award speech, but I do, however, have to thank my agent, who was also my wife. And Jill and I came to Bowdoin, about 30 years ago. And I have to confess, for an architectural and urban historian, Brunswick was not necessarily on her top 10 major American cities to settle down in. Not even sure it makes the top 20 in that regard. But settle down we did. We raised our 2 kids. Unfortunately, they're not here, but they better be streaming this. There will be a quiz afterwards. Anyway, Jill, after she finished her dissertation, she carved out a position in the environmental studies program by dint of pedagogical ingenuity and her signature energy. And she's been inspiring students to study the built environment, ever since, sending many of them off to graduate school in architecture and urban planning. In my book, she's the real Barry and Wish professor. Maybe you should give this lecture. All right, let's get down to it. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about my recent book on Rousseau and Nietzsche. And this is really a total novel experience for me. I'm doing a PowerPoint. So, I know, this is scary. Voila. Now, this is actually not the cover I wanted. I wanted this cover. But the press nixed that idea. But I'm going to leave it up there. So, I suppose the first question to address is why I have put these 2 thinkers, separated by more than 100 years, into conversation with one another. Not only do they belong to different centuries, they also seem to inhabit entirely different mental landscapes. Rousseau writes his greatest works at the height of the 18th century French Enlightenment, while Nietzsche composes his at the end of the 19th century, when the Enlightenment dream of scientific progress and cosmopolitan liberalism was beginning to show some serious cracks. There are, of course, a number of formal similarities between the 2 thinkers. First and most obviously, they're both brilliant writers, possessing literary gifts that are not often found in philosophers. Think Kant and Hegel. Indeed, one might have to go all the way back to Plato to find their equal in this regard. Second, and not unconnected to their literary genius, Rousseau and Nietzsche both had an influence on the broader culture around them that went far beyond the narrow confines of professional philosophy, extending to the art, morality, religion, and politics of their respective ages. This is obvious with respect to Rousseau, about whom Henry Maine famously observed, "We have never seen in our own generation, indeed the world has not seen more than once or twice in all of history, a literature which has exercised such prodigious influence over the minds of men, over every caste and shade of intellect, as that which emanated from Rousseau between 1749 and 1762. But it is no less true that Nietzsche exercised a similarly powerful influence over the minds of 20th century thinkers and writers with the works he produced between 1872 and 1888. And that influence shows no sign of abating. Finally, not the end of the lecture, not so fast. Finally, Rousseau and Nietzsche were both pretty strange guys. After putting all five of his children in foundling homes, repudiating his friends, and being exiled from France, Rousseau ended his days in a state of profound isolation and paranoia. Nietzsche fared even worse. Unmarried, alone, often ill, he moved from one rooming house to another in Switzerland, southern France, and northern Italy, until he finally collapsed in a street in Turin and spent the last 10 years of his life in a state of complete and catatonic insanity. All of this is mildly interesting, but it doesn't really answer the question of why one would write a book comparing Rousseau and Nietzsche. A more promising answer to that question starts from the observation that Rousseau and Nietzsche offer two of the most penetrating critiques of modern liberal Enlightenment civilization, our civilization. Though importantly different, as I will demonstrate in a moment, these critiques share a common dissatisfaction with the image of the human being bequeathed to us by such early Enlightenment thinkers as Hobbes and Locke, the rationally self-interested individual driven by the desire for self-preservation, security, and property and bourgeois comfort. This image struck Rousseau and Nietzsche, as well as a whole host of thinkers who lived in the interval between them, as an utterly impoverished and uninspiring conception of what it is to be a human being. Now, some of you may be thinking, hold on a second. In our current historical moment, when science is under assault, populist authoritarianism is on the rise, and liberal democracy is teetering, the last thing we need is an attack on Enlightenment values. We don't need a critique of Enlightenment liberalism so much as a vigorous defense of it. There is no doubt something to this. But while Enlightenment liberalism has undoubtedly given modern human beings many good things, enumerated most recently and dogmatically by Steven Pinker in his book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, its weak spot has always been the sort of human being it promoted, one that is preoccupied with comfortable self-preservation and driven by calculation of self-interest rather than by imagination and lofty goals. As I've indicated, it is precisely this moral and cultural deficit of modern Enlightenment liberalism that is the object of Rousseau's and Nietzsche's critiques. It is time to delve more deeply into those critiques, along with the proposals for reform that grow out of them. I begin with Rousseau's, which forms the template for almost all critiques of Enlightenment modernity that come later, including Nietzsche's. Wow. Rousseau launches his critique of modern European society in his 1750 Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, the essay that made him a household name in France almost overnight. The focus of his critique in this essay is the insincerity of modern bourgeois morality, a morality that possesses the appearances of all the virtues without having a single one. What is most problematic about this morality from Rousseau's point of view is that it hypocritically conceals the motives that are the exact opposite of the ones it pretends to act on. Beneath the deceitful veil and vaunted urbanity to which we owe the Enlightenment of our century, he writes, there lies nothing but suspicion, hatred, and betrayal. Rousseau ultimately traces this hypocrisy back to the bourgeois social system that puts men in a position where they can only live by obstructing, supplanting, betraying, and destroying one another. A system in which everyone pretends to be working for the profit or reputation of the rest, while only seeking to raise his own above theirs and at their expense. As important as as Rousseau's critique of modern bourgeois society is, it is his genealogical account of the ills he diagnoses that may constitute his most original contribution to late modern moral and political thought. This genealogical account is found in Rousseau's 1754 Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality, in which he shows that the ills he has highlighted are not inherent in human nature, but have been brought about by human beings through the social institutions they have created. According to Rousseau, and in contradistinction to Christian teaching, as well as Hobbes's political philosophy, man is naturally good. It is society that has depraved him and made him miserable. Rousseau's assertion of the natural goodness of man has, of course, been criticized from a variety of angles. And I just have to find where those angles are. From a variety of angles, but it is important to realize that it is not as naive or optimistic as is often supposed, even by Nietzsche. For Rousseau, the natural goodness of human beings has nothing to do with moral goodness or virtue. Rather, it consists merely in the absence of wickedness or perversity in the human heart. The natural human being is closer to an animal than a human being, possessing only very simple desires, as Rousseau puts it, food, a female, and rest. He is devoid of imagination, foresight, and curiosity. Above all, the natural human being lacks pride, or what Rousseau calls amour propre, a sentiment that originates in comparisons and leads individuals to seek to be first among their fellows. It is the presence of pride or amour propre that made Hobbes's state of nature a war of all against all, and its absence makes Rousseau's state of nature non-competitive and relatively peaceful. Precisely because man in the state of nature is not much more than a stupid, limited animal, and that's Rousseau's phrase, he does not represent Rousseau's ideal. Against the primitivist misunderstanding of his intention, Rousseau in no way advocates a return to the state of nature. He explicitly rejects the notion that society should be destroyed, mine and thine annihilated, and men return to live in the forest with bears. Because the original simplicity of most human beings has been irrevocably destroyed, they can no longer live on grass and acorns, nor do without laws and chiefs. Nevertheless, Rousseau's account of man's natural goodness in the state of nature does serve an important normative function, namely, to denaturalize the current degraded condition of human beings, showing that this condition is not the result of human nature per se, but rather of the social institutions human beings have created. What previous thinkers had attributed to the evil inherent in human nature, Rousseau attributes to social and historical circumstances. He turns to these circumstances, what he calls his genealogy of vice, in the account in the second half of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Rousseau's account of the degeneration of the human species after it exits the pure state of nature is quite complex and involves many different stages, not all of them entirely negative. But the crucial turning point comes with the introduction of the division of labor and economic interdependence occasioned by the discovery of metallurgy and agriculture. Prior to this development, Rousseau argues human beings were economically self-sufficient, doing all the things necessary for survival by themselves. The discovery of metallurgy and agriculture, however, destroyed this primitive independence, leading human beings to specialize in one or the other of these arts and to exchange the surplus of what they produced for what they otherwise lacked. Rousseau makes clear that he sees mutual dependence of the sort found in an economy based on the division of labor, self-interest, and exchange to be the true source of human misery and vice. In the first place, it led to the establishment of private property, which is necessary for agriculture, Without assurance that one would not be despoiled of one's harvest, there would be no motivation to cultivate the land. More disastrously, private property led to inequality. In the pure state of nature, Rousseau argues there was relatively little inequality of talents, and what little there was had almost no effect. Once property was introduced, however, being stronger, more skilled, or more ingenious allowed one to acquire more property, and this inequality began to exercise a profound influence on the fate of individuals. Clearly, this represents something of a climax in a work entitled Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. But it is important to note that it is not the sheer fact of inequality that makes it so pernicious in Rousseau's eyes. Rather, the real problem with inequality lies in its forcing everyone to become consumed with the perpetual and restless desire to achieve comparative economic advantage over one's fellow human beings, thus inflaming the dangerous passion of amour propre. Because everyone's rank and fate is determined not only by the amount of goods he has, but by the qualities that enabled him to acquire them: strength, beauty, eloquence, intelligence. Human beings soon began to affect or simulate these qualities, thus reducing everything to appearances. And because everything depends on one's relative position in such a system, there is no genuine common interest between human beings. Everyone seeks to profit at everyone else's expense. Rousseau never bought into the 18th century orthodoxy that economic interdependence produces a common interest among human beings. Rather, he consistently argues that such interdependence puts men in a position where they can only live together by obstructing, supplanting, deceiving, and betraying and destroying one another. All these evils, he concludes, are the first effect of property and of the inseparable train of inequality. Having traced the ills of humanity back to the bourgeois social system, Rousseau turns his attention in his later, more constructive works to finding various remedies for them. I'm going to confine myself to the political remedy he puts forward in the social contract, since it was the one for which he was best known in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and the one that most profoundly shaped Nietzsche's image of Rousseau. The project of the social contract is to overcome the personal dependence Rousseau has identified as the fundamental problem of the bourgeois social system. More positively, it is to establish the conditions of individual liberty, which Rousseau says consist less in doing one's own will than in not being subject to someone else's. What makes this task so difficult is that human beings have come together to form a community precisely because they need one another and are mutually dependent. How can one retain one's freedom, understood as self-dependence, in these interdependent circumstances? Rousseau responds paradoxically, claiming, only by everyone's totally alienating himself and all of his rights to the whole community. The key lies in the equality of this alienation. Rousseau explains that since each gives himself entirely, the condition is equal for all. And since the condition is equal for all, no one has any interest in making it burdensome for the rest. The complete reciprocity of the arrangement eliminates any possibility of personal dependence. Political equality or democracy is the indispensable condition of individual liberty in the civil state. In the rest of the social contract, Rousseau goes on to elaborate how democratic sovereignty can be reconciled with individual liberty. Central to his argument is the idea of the general will, which he identifies with the common good. I can already hear some groans with the mention of that phrase, the general will, from students who have taken modern political philosophy. I, however, am not going to give a detailed explanation of this notoriously ambiguous idea. This is a general lecture, after all, and not a dissertation. But I only want to indicate that it embodies the equality and reciprocity that are at the heart of Rousseau's political philosophy. Why is the general will always upright, he asks, if not because there is no one who does not appropriate the word each to himself and think of himself as he votes for all. Rousseau does not demand that citizens sacrifice their self-interest when entering the social contract, only that they generalize it. This accounts for the central role and rule of law in the social contract. It is through subjection to impersonal law that the individual is liberated from personal dependence. As Rousseau put it in one of his other political writings, the problem of reconciling governmental authority with individual liberty is resolved by the most sublime of all institutions. By what inconceivable art were the means found to subjugate men in order to make them free? How can it be that they obey and no one commands, that they serve and yet have no master? These marvels are the work of law. But Rousseau realizes that laws alone, accompanied by punishment, are not sufficient to maintain a liberal polity. Citizens must possess the appropriate ethical habits, customs, manners, and dispositions to have the necessary motivation to carry out their duties. In the social contract, the task of forming the ethical dispositions of citizens and instilling civic virtue is given to the extraordinary figure of the lawgiver, whose founding legislation changes human nature and transforms each individual who by himself is a perfect solitary whole into a part of a larger whole from which he derives his life and being. Democracy cannot work without public-spirited and patriotic citizens. For this reason, Rousseau decries the use of political representatives and defends a highly participatory democracy. As soon as public service ceases to be the citizens' principal business, he writes, and they prefer to serve with their purse rather than their person, the state is already close to ruin. This is why Rousseau rejects the bourgeois liberalism of his day and holds up the ancient republics of Greece and Rome as his models. Rousseau goes very far in his emphasis on civic virtue and love of fatherland, even advocating the institution of a civil religion. And this has given rise to the charge that he is some sort of collectivist or totalitarian thinker. I do not think this is the case, though. While there's certainly a strong communitarian dimension to Rousseau's political thought, he does not elevate communal solidarity above individual freedom. Civic virtue and patriotism remain completely in the service of freedom from personal dependence of individual citizens and of the role of law that is its most important condition. Despite his critique of a certain type of bourgeois Enlightenment liberalism, Rousseau ends up putting forward a powerful vision of liberal democracy. Alas, this cannot be said of our other critic of Enlightenment modernity, Friedrich Nietzsche, who criticized Rousseau precisely for his liberal democratic egalitarianism. It is to this much more radical critic of Enlightenment modernity that we must now turn. The first thing that strikes us when we view Nietzsche's critique of modern society next to Rousseau's is how unpolitical it is, even anti-political. This is especially true with respect to Nietzsche's earliest writings, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, and The Untimely Meditations, written between 1873 and 1876. Instead of politics, these writings focus on culture, a word with a rich and wide-ranging meaning in 19th century Germany. For Nietzsche, it refers to a sphere deeper than politics, comprising morals, religion, art, science, and philosophy. In other words, the whole moral, spiritual, and intellectual estate of human beings. In one of his untimely meditations, Schopenhauer as educator, Nietzsche rails against the Hegelian doctrine that the state is the highest goal of mankind and that man has no higher duty than to serve the state. There are men and duties existing beyond this, he writes, which is why he is concerned with a species of man whose teleology extends somewhat beyond the welfare of a state, with philosophers, and with these only in relation to a world which is again fairly independent of a state, that of culture. It is in the realm of culture that Nietzsche argues that the fundamental corruption of the modern age reveals itself most significantly. Again, in Schopenhauer's Educator, he gives a concise description of this crisis in modern culture. Its symptoms include an almost universal haste and hurry, the increasing velocity of life, and the cessation of all contemplativeness and simplicity. He goes on to elaborate. The waters of religion are ebbing away and leaving behind swamps and stagnant pools. The sciences, pursued without any restraint and in the spirit of blindest laissez-faire, are shattering and dissolving all firmly held belief. The educated classes are being swept along by a hugely contemptible money economy. The world has never been more worldly, never poorer in love and goodness. The educated classes are no longer lighthouses for or refuges in the midst of this turmoil of secularization. They themselves grow daily more restless and thoughtless and loveless. Everything, contemporary art and science included, serves the coming barbarism. Nietzsche concludes this important passage by stating that we live in the age of atoms, of atomistic chaos, in which individuals pursue their momentary egoistic desires and society lacks any unifying bond. The difference between Nietzsche's critique of modern civilization and Rousseau's emerges quite clearly from this passage. Whereas Rousseau's critique focused on the hypocritical bourgeois who, driven by amour propre, constantly compares himself with others and competes for relative advantage, Nietzsche's emphasizes the loss of direction, purpose, and meaning in culture, and the consequent loss of passion, energy, and aspiration in the individual. And whereas Rousseau traced our woes back to the bourgeois system of mutual dependence and social inequality based on property, Nietzsche puts much of the blame, at least in his early writings, on science and the unnatural growth of the historical sense. He analyzes the latter in another one of his untimely meditations, The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, where he argues that the excessive development of the historical sense has led to the dissolution of the closed horizons that give life meaning and culture unity. By cramming ourselves full of arts, customs, philosophies, and religions of various historical epochs, we become merely walking encyclopedias, but not vigorous, creative, and productive human beings. By trying to be at home in all ages, we end up becoming culturally homeless. As Nietzsche's thought develops in his middle and later writings, the focus of his critique of modern civilization shifts from science and history to morality, specifically the morality of pity or altruism that derives from Christianity. Concerned above all with comfortable self-preservation, such a morality seeks to abolish suffering while striving after, in Nietzsche's memorable phrase, the universal green pasture happiness of the herd, with security, lack of danger, comfort, and an easier life for everyone. In the book that inaugurates Nietzsche's campaign against morality, Daybreak, published in 1881, he refers to the morality of altruism that seeks to eliminate all danger and suffering from life as the cult of philanthropy. and he argues that it threatens to lead to the abolition of the individual and to reduce humanity to sand, small, soft, round, unending sand. This is the fate Nietzsche most memorably warns about in his devastating portrait of the last man in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Safe, secure, comfortable, and enjoying good health and long life, the last man has his little pleasure for the day and his little pleasure for the night, and imagines he has invented happiness. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? Asks the last man uncomprehendingly, and he blinks. The result is a world of utter uniformity, devoid of authentic individuality. Everybody wants the same, everybody is the same, and whoever feels differently goes voluntarily into the madhouse. I have indicated that Nietzsche sees this herd morality as the outgrowth of Christianity, but he also connects it with democracy. Indeed, he considers democracy to be the logical outcome of Christianity in this regard. As he puts it in one place, the democratic movement is the heir of the Christian movement. Nietzsche highlights the connection between democracy and Christianity and their common tendency to promote uniformity and suppress individuality in a striking passage from his notebooks. The more the feeling of unity with one's fellow humans gains the upper hand, the more human beings are made uniform, the more they will perceive all diversity as immoral. In this way, the sand of humanity comes into being. He likes that metaphor of sand. In this way, the sand of humanity necessarily comes into being. All are very similar, very small, very round, very accommodating, very boring. Christianity and democracy have done the most to drive humanity along the path towards sand. This no doubt strikes those of us who still retain some faith in democracy as quite harsh and perhaps unfair. But it is important to remember that Nietzsche is not alone in articulating these worries about democracy. The two greatest liberal Democrats of the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill, expressed similar concern about the leveling and homogenizing effects of democracy. Of course, Nietzsche goes much further than either of these thinkers in his criticisms of democracy, and he also called Mill a blockhead. And what of Rousseau? It probably does not come as a surprise that with the shift in the object of his critique of modern society from science to Christian morality and democracy, Nietzsche's antipathy toward Rousseau becomes more pronounced. He sums up the difference in their outlooks in an aphorism aptly titled, Contra Rousseau. If it is true, he writes, that our civilization has something pitiable about it, you have the choice of concluding with Rousseau that this pitiable civilization is to blame for our bad morality, or against Rousseau that our good morality is to blame for the pitiableness of our civilization. Nietzsche, of course, opts for the latter alternative, arguing that our weak, unmanly social concepts of good and evil and their tremendous ascendancy over body and soul have finally weakened all bodies and souls and sapped the self-reliant, independent, unprejudiced men, the pillars of a strong civilization. Above all, Nietzsche criticizes Rousseau as the apostle of egalitarian democracy and the progenitor of the French Revolution. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he compares preachers of equality like Rousseau to tarantulas, because their opposition to inequality is motivated chiefly by envy and revenge. Anticipating the egalitarian appropriation of his own teaching in what might be called Nietzscheanism American style, he cautions that he does not want to be mixed up and confused with these vengeful preachers of equality. For to me, justice speaks thus: men are not equal, nor should they become equal. The should here is significant. It is not just that human beings are factually unequal, they should also strive to be so. For Nietzsche, inequality, struggle, and self-overcoming belong to the essence of life. Life, he writes, wants to build itself into the heights with pillars and steps. It wants to look into vast distances and out towards stirring beauties. Therefore, it requires height. And because it requires height, it requires steps and contradiction among the steps and the climbers. Life wants to climb and to overcome itself climbing. In these lines, we can begin to discern the constructive project that grows out of Nietzsche's critique of the softness and mediocrity of modern democratic life. And this is where we enter very deep and troubling waters, populated by Übermenschen or supermen, aristocratic castes, and slaves. What Nietzsche himself refers to as his great politics is certainly quite strange and highly controversial. He seems to defend some form of aristocracy composed of higher human beings, but beyond that, it is very difficult to make out what exactly or concretely he has in mind. This, of course, has not prevented readers from filling in the blanks. In the first instance, the Nazis, partly aided by the clever manipulation of Nietzsche's writings by his anti-Semitic sister, had no trouble appropriating Nietzsche's references to Übermenschen, blonde beasts, and master races for their own diabolical political project. After World War II, the prolific translator of Nietzsche's works, Walter Kaufmann, struggled mightily to rehabilitate Nietzsche's image, casting him as an anti-political exponent of individualistic self-cultivation. French post-structuralists followed in this anti-political direction and tried to enlist Nietzsche for their radically critical deconstructive project. This, of course, called forth the inevitable counter-reaction from scholars who simply pointed to the literal words on the page to argue that Nietzsche advocates an aristocratic political system in which the gifted few rule over, manipulate, oppress, enslave, and sometimes even exterminate the mediocre many. As I bring this lecture to a close, and by the way, I wrote that line before I'd gotten to the end of the lecture, so don't get your hopes up again. We're not nearly as close as that suggests. As I bring this lecture to a close, let's see if we can make sense of Nietzsche's deeply ambiguous constructive project. Perhaps the best place to begin is with the aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil that contains the clearest statement of what Nietzsche understands an aristocratic society to be and why he finds it desirable. Every enhancement of the type man, he writes, has so far been the work of an aristocratic society, and it will be so again and again. A society that believes in the long ladder of an order of rank and differences in value between man and man, and that needs slavery in some sense or other. Without that pathos of difference, which grows out of the ingrained differences between strata, when the ruling caste constantly looks afar and looks down upon subjects and instruments, that other, more mysterious pathos could not have grown up either. The craving for an ever new widening of distances within the soul itself, the development of ever higher, rarer, more remote, further stretching, more comprehensive states. In brief, simply the enhancement of the type man. There are several things to note in this remarkable passage. First, the goal of Nietzsche's aristocratic great politics is the enhancement of the type man, a phrase he repeats twice. His concern is not with the happiness of a few individuals, but with the perfection of the human species as a whole. Second, there is nothing in the passage to suggest that Nietzsche is concerned to establish aristocratic political institutions. For him, an aristocratic society is understood to be a society that believes in the long ladder of an order of rank and differences between man and man, one that is characterized by the pathos of distance between strata. He mentions a ruling caste and subjects, but the sort of rule he has in mind seems to be spiritual or cultural rather than strictly political. None of this suggests that Nietzsche is not defending aristocracy in some sense, only that he associates it primarily with a system of values, an ethical and cultural outlook, rather than a literal set of political institutions. Finally, and perhaps most troublingly, Nietzsche asserts that the enhancement of the type man requires slavery in some sense or other. He is even more explicit in the aphorism that follows the one just quoted, stating that in a healthy aristocracy, an untold number of human beings must be sacrificed, reduced to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments, for the sake of the higher, more spiritual human beings. If we look elsewhere in Nietzsche's writings, however, we find that he has a rather broad understanding of slavery. In an earlier work, he defines a slave as anyone who does not have 2/3 of his day to himself, which would make me a slave. And in a note from 1884, he claims that slavery exists in every society, whether you want it or not. For example, the Prussian civil servant, the scholar, the monk. It is slavery in just this sort of sense that Nietzsche sees as gaining ground in Europe as a result of democracy. The process of democratization has created a supranational and nomadic type of man who is eminently trainable, adaptable, and even intelligent. Such a useful, industrious, handy, multi-purpose herd animal is fit for what Nietzsche calls slavery in the subtlest sense. In this way, the democratization of Europe is inadvertently creating conditions for a new and even more refined aristocracy. The very same conditions that will on average lead to the leveling and mediocratizing of man, Nietzsche writes, are likely to give birth to exceptional human beings of the most dangerous and attractive quality. The process of democratization thus serves as a training ground not only for slavery in the subtlest sense, but for cultivation of tyrants in the most spiritual sense. Here and elsewhere, Nietzsche uses the image of base and superstructure, not in the Marxian sense, to describe the relationship between the few and the many. He conceives of high culture as a pyramid, but that requires a broad, sturdy base to support the lofty spiritual achievements of the few. This suggests something else about the relationship of the few to many, namely that the former do not rule or lead the latter in any sort of conventional political sense. A note from the time of Zarathustra brings this out nicely, describing the relationship between the last men, and the Übermenschen. Nietzsche writes, "The goal is not at all to conceive of the latter, the Übermenschen, as the masters of the former, the last men, but rather the two species should exist alongside of one another, as segregated as possible, the one like the Epicurean gods having no concern for the other." This image of the aristocratic few and mediocre many coexisting in separate spheres can be found in many of the notes from Nietzsche's later years. In one, he writes, "Main consideration, not to see the task of the higher species in leading the lower, but the lower as a base upon which the higher species performs its own tasks." In another, he says of the master race, excoriated by so many of Nietzsche's critics, that it is not a race whose sole task is to rule, but a race with its own sphere of life, with an excess of strength for beauty, bravery, culture, manners, a hothouse for strange and choice plants. All of this suggests that Nietzsche's aristocratic great politics are not necessarily incompatible with democracy. Indeed, they seem to have little to do with politics in any sort of conventional sense. They are concerned, rather, with culture. Nietzsche never abandons the view he expressed in his earliest writings that culture belongs to a sphere that is independent of and higher than the state. In the last year of his sanity, he writes, "Culture and the state, one should not deceive oneself over this, are antagonists. All great cultural epochs are epochs of political decline. That which is great in the cultural sense has been unpolitical, even anti-political." While this certainly acquits Nietzsche of some of the more sinister interpretations of his philosophy, it does not get him completely off the hook. For his preoccupation with culture and the cultivation of the individual leads him to neglect and frequently to denigrate politics in the mundane, institutional, and utterly necessary sense. We who live in the shadow of the atrocities of the 20th century and the looming crises of the 21st do not have that luxury. There is also the question of Nietzsche's rhetoric, his intentionally provocative praise of masters, tyrants, blonde beasts, and supermen, his glorification of cruelty, exploitation, and slavery. I won't even mention his notorious comments about women. While it is no doubt true that the Nazis' appropriation of Nietzsche's ideas represented an abuse of them, it must be added that Nietzsche's rhetoric made it singularly easy for them to, for his ideas to be abused. Saul Bellow makes this point quite effectively in his great comic novel Herzog, in which the cuckolded protagonist writes desperate and hilarious letters to people like Heidegger, Spinoza, Adlai Stevenson, and President Eisenhower. He also writes to Nietzsche. "Dear Herr Nietzsche, I have great admiration for you, sympathy. You want to make us able to live with the void, not lie ourselves into good-naturedness, trust, ordinary middling considerations, but to question as has never been questioned before. You reject mankind as it is, that ordinary, practical, thieving, stinking, unilluminated, sodden rabble, and not only the laboring rabble, but even worse, the educated rabble with its books and concerts and lectures, its liberalism. Okay, still, your extremists survive. Your immoralists also eat meat. They ride the bus. Humankind lives mainly upon perverted ideas. Perverted, your ideas are no better than the Christianity you condemn. Any philosopher who wants to keep his contact with mankind should pervert his own system in advance to see how it will really look a few decades after adoption. I send you greetings from this mere border of grassy temporal light and wish you happiness wherever you are. Yours, under the veil of Maya, Moses Herzog." Should all of this send us scurrying back to Rousseau? Or possibly even to such pillars of Enlightenment liberalism as boring old Locke and the American founders? At least as far as Rousseau is concerned, we have seen that there is a lot there to commend. He offers a trenchant critique of bourgeois liberalism that locates the source of its corruption in the social system, mutual dependence, and inequality based on property. It is from this social system that amor propre acquires its peculiarly destructive bent. Thus, its destructive bent leading human beings to seek comparative economic advantage over others and to find self-worth in the opinions of others. Rousseau's heirs are Marx, as well as many of today's advocates for social justice. For all of its contemporary appeal, however, I do not think Rousseau's critique of modern society or his political remedy goes quite as deep as Nietzsche's. More even than from social inequality and the alienation it produces, modern civilization seems to suffer from aimlessness and drift in the wake of God's death. As Nietzsche puts it in one place, the modern human being knows not which way to turn. He is everything that knows not which way to turn. Nor does the democratic ideal of the greatest happiness for the greatest number seem to address this nihilistic situation or satisfy our deepest longings for human and cultural greatness. We need a new goal to strive after, and this is what Nietzsche aims to provide in his philosophy of the future. He is not unaware of the risks involved in this enterprise. He refers to himself as the philosopher of the dangerous maybe. But these risks pale in comparison to the threat of nihilism and the prospect of a humanity turned into sand, small, soft, round, unending sand. Many will no doubt wonder whether Nietzsche has exaggerated the direness of our situation. After all, even in the absence of lofty goals and transcendent belief, most of us manage to lead modestly happy and interesting lives. But that may constitute our greatest danger, according to Nietzsche. The danger of self-satisfied last men and women who ask, what is love? What is creation? What is longing? And blink. So it's question time, and I hope there's something controversial in there maybe to respond to. I'm not going to call on Jean Yarbrough. Anybody? Jean is, I welcome your question.
Paul, that was a great lecture and much deserved the honor that you have tonight. I have to say, it's just overdue. That's the only bad thing I can say about it. You long deserve this, and I'm very happy to celebrate with you. The question that I have is...
I think that's all you get.
The question is... I have a great deal of sympathy with Nietzsche's criticism of democratic culture. Tocqueville makes many of those points, as you know, you've written about them. I don't see how you can somehow try to save Nietzsche for a democratic society. You want somehow to separate the culture from the politics and hold out some hope. But what really would that look like? I mean, what kind of educational system, what kind of cultural formation that separates out the aristocrats, those who are born to rule, who will lead, who will be like the Sipo Matador, one of our favorite images, that all of society exists as a scaffolding for the blossoming of the geniuses and the most excellent human types. How do you democratize that?
That's kind of the big question, isn't it? My response to that is, I actually do think there is, I do think that Nietzsche has this idea that the aristocracy he talks about can coexist with democracy, that democracy is kind of go on and will provide the slaves in his peculiar understanding of that term and leave this other group of individuals to do their amazing things. I do think there's something sociologically very problematic about that. It's hard to understand how that group of aristocrats, I mean, I think he does hope that they, at the very least, even if they don't rule, literally in a political sense, they will set the tone for society, that they will somehow exercise an influence that, might, inspire others to join the project. And yet I find it hard to believe that, lacking some sort of political mechanism, that is necessarily the case. I mean, I suppose Nietzsche thinks that if you think of these people largely as artists, for example, or if not just artists who create works of art, artists of themselves, magnificent individuals, I think there is something to, that group of individuals exerting some influence, I believe, over a society. And the educational institutions, it's not going to be public education. It's going to be the kind of education that might come from, joining institutions or groups where you mutually support one another in this endeavor. I mean, Nietzsche, just to give, I think for him, it's hard to give concrete examples in the present. At the very beginning of his career, of his writing career, he was very enamored of Richard Wagner, the great opera composer. And he was very interested in Wagner's cultural project of Bayreuth, where there would be performances of Wagner's Ring Cycle. And this kind of cultural event would somehow refresh and inspire and bring a certain group of people together to, I think, to join together in the pursuit of these loftier goals. Of course, he became disenchanted with Wagner. He took one look at the people who attended Bayreuth and figured out these were not his people that were there. They looked like the kind of bourgeois that he despised. But I think that gives at least some idea of what he's thinking about in terms of both education and how art and culture might exert an influence that could lift people up and out of the sandy depths in which he sees them mired.
Paul, congratulations. President Rose wore jeans. I'm wearing a blazer for you. And I had a gin and tonic tonight, so I think I trumped him. The question I have actually concerns I think the missing middle who keeps haunting this talk. Not your face, but one with even more interesting hair. Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Which is to say, you mentioned Marx as sort of in the tradition of Rousseau, as a fellow product of Enlightenment, critic of Enlightenment, who's outlining a radical critique of democracy. But in some ways, he goes even further in his outline. And his critique, and almost to Nietzschean levels, but using much different arguments. Does he not bridge in a way? I mean, and Nietzsche in a way has to ignore that. So I'm just interested if you could say more about his sort of triangulation there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the most kind of fascinating things about Nietzsche that he never mentions Marx. And of course, Marx, Nietzsche's writing in the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, Marx is a well-known figure at this point. And yet there's nary a mention of Marx in Nietzsche's writings. Nietzsche does talk a lot about socialism. And he has a variety of utopian socialists and possibly even Marxian socialists in mind. He himself would not have regarded that, I thought he would not have welcomed that bridging role that Marx might play, because again, I think he sees Marx very much in the same, as part of that same continuum that runs from Christianity to democracy to socialism. In some ways, socialism is just a further stage on the path toward the sand that he dreads, the abolition of the individual. It will be the ultimate leveling of humanity. I think that's kind of his. He doesn't see much of a solution in that regard. As I was writing this book, there are many books that are written on Marx and Nietzsche, as a matter of fact, because they're kind of a fascinating pair to look at together. I teach a course, in fact, which concludes really with these two radical critiques of liberal democracy from the left, the Marxian side, and from the right in a much more vague sense with Nietzsche. So there's a lot there. I ended up writing a book on Rousseau and Nietzsche, and part of the reason for that is I do think that Marx, much of that is in Marx, can be traced back to Rousseau. And at the end of the day, I do find Rousseau just a much more profound moralist than Marx. And that is one reason for pairing these two thinkers together, that I see both of them as profound moralists, that they are, I think they're the ones who really do have the kind of deepest insight into what ails modern folks. So I see Marx, a little bit of a knock on Marx, a little bit more derivative, and just not as profound a thinker as either of the ones that I've written on. Nevertheless, important figure to mention in this context. Come on, students, save me from these. These are the toughies.
Thank you for that talk, Paul. So yes, that was an excellent talk, and in addition to all of your accolades, all the books, you're also the only Nietzsche scholar I've ever met who doesn't smoke or wear black boots. So that should be noted. Somehow, because of your brown shoes, you still harbor a deep-seated commitment to liberal democracy, and I appreciate that.
I actually tried to start smoking many times, but it just never took.
Oh. Stay with it, my friend, somehow. All right. Well, all right. So, thinking about this idea from Rousseau of preserving appearances, but using that to look at Nietzsche, I hear you sorting between two levels of speech in Nietzsche. That there's his philosophy, there's this highly principled and really refined way of thinking, or some of his text reveals that, and then there's the rhetoric, which you reference at the end. That his rhetoric can be harsh and brutal and violent, deeply bigoted, easily appropriated. And I wonder, doesn't this rhetoric reveal more about a human's commitments than just the philosophy? It seems like, were we to, and I wonder why you're not drawing upon that rhetoric to illuminate the philosophy, where instead I hear you using or trying to kind of, as if you're separating the wheat from the chaff or something like that. I'm not an agriculturalist, but yeah, that you're trying to protect and preserve and resuscitate and elevate the philosophy and kind of distance it from this really, often violent and viciously bigoted rhetoric. But why not do it? Why not take it the other way around? Don't we really reveal our true selves, right? Or do what polite society isn't supposed to allow us to do, which is to be authentic in public. You know, when we are using, you know, passionate rhetoric. And so I wonder about that method that you're adopting, where you're really trying to kind of say, well, here's where the philosophy is, and yeah, he said all this other stuff, but we're not going to really take that too seriously. You know, it's really easily appropriated, and it gets very ugly when you follow that the line of appropriation down too far.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that that very good question, and am somewhat worried by it. You're absolutely right about what I'm trying to do. That is to say, it is a bit of a separating of the wheat from the chaff kind of endeavor. And to some extent, yes, trying to save Nietzsche. It's a, you know, I don't necessarily want to be apologetic for Nietzsche. And there's, as I say at the end, you know, there's much there that I find it very difficult to endorse. I thought for a second you were saying I should just embrace that side of Nietzsche, but you really want me just to treat that as not as an accident of his philosophy, but the very essence of his philosophy. You know, I possibly, but you know, once you go down that route, it really does, it does kind of lead to throwing Nietzsche out the, you know, throwing the books out the window. And my profound conviction is that there's a whole lot there that is tremendously worthwhile and from which we can learn a great deal. So I'm kind of in the position where I have to, you know, if I do believe there's something really important there and something that's still viable and still useful to us today, I kind of have to engage in the separating operation that you've described. I'd add one more thing to that, and that is, you know, why does, I think that your question invites another question is, why does Nietzsche use this rhetoric? And I mean, in the first instance, Nietzsche is someone who does, as a writer, want to grab you. He's not just presenting an intellectual argument. He is trying to affect you at a very emotional and passional level, as well as an intellectual level. I think in this respect, he was, and the quotes that I selected, I tried to find the most punchy ones. They're not very hard to find, to tell you the truth. I probably could have come up with many more. But I think Nietzsche's belief was the kind of bourgeois, democratic, even socializing society that was looming on the horizon was so baked in, so firmly implanted, and so unshakable. And I think this was his error, so unshakable that to use the most violent rhetoric was what it would take to make even a dent in the complacency that he saw all around him. Again, I do think, you know, another century passes, and I think it was, I mean, in this regard, I think he's a little bit like Marx. I think both Marx and Nietzsche kind of assume that, you know, many problems have already been resolved, and now we need to move on to, you know, the higher things. I mean, for Marx, it's going to, you know, include rectifying the lower things, but, you know, ultimately we want to get someplace loftier. But both of them, I think, are far too optimistic about how fragile, you know, our civilization is. And it really took, you know, the events surrounding World War II and World War I, for that matter, to just reveal that, you know, the brutality was not far beneath the surface. So I think a tremendous misjudgment on his part there. But I think the motivation was shake the complacent ones, and, you know, no harm will come, and maybe, just maybe, somebody will listen. But again, I can already see the reviews of the book. I think this one is going to be coming. Is this a student?
This is me. Hi.
It's Isabella Angel. Okay.
Yes. So that was wonderful. This is perfect. It's like I get 3 days in a row of class. So I guess my question sort of relates to this notion of having sort of Nietzschean aristocratic tastemakers in culture and sort of artists that guide the way in a democracy. And I guess I'm just wondering, if you had these people and you could raise them in a democracy and then they could sort of go and put their artistic works out in the world, would people in a democracy even like or appreciate them? I think my mind kind of goes back to Socrates, who was this kind of pro-aristocratic sort of tastemaker in a democracy. And I mean, look what happened to him.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just wondering, even if we could get this in a democracy, would people listen to them enough for them to guide culture at all?
Yeah. I think in some ways Nietzsche, as time went on, became more and more pessimistic about how, and this is really goes back to the Wagnerian thing. I mean, I think the Wagnerian cultural artistic project really did envisage lifting up the whole of German culture. And, you know, more people than just belong to, you know, the very narrow band of cultural elite, that it was ultimately intended to have that democratic reach and effect. And I think Nietzsche was enamored of that then. And, you know, actually, as time goes on, there are those moments where he still seems to hold out some hope. But I do think by the end of his career, you really do get this image that I kind of come back to several times at the end of the talk, to almost two separate types of humanity that really have very little to do with one another. And I think Nietzsche's only hope here was, you know, you're not going to change, you're just not going to change everybody, nor probably the vast majority of people, but there still might be this sphere or band of people that are engaged in this kind of experimental living, experimental creating. And for him, he even uses this language. He says, it's precisely the achievements of those few. Hell, it could be the Picassos or the Joyces or the T.S. Eliots, you know, all those people that may not also reach, you know, the vast majority of people. But there's a way in which those achievements and the giving of space and endorsing and kind of valuing those achievements, that's ultimately going to, and I'm going to use a phrase he uses, enhance the type man. It's not going to enhance everybody, but it will somehow broaden all that we consider to be the human experience. And that for him, he says at one point, ultimately justifies democracy. If democracy is just the greatest good for the greatest number, Nietzsche feels that just ain't enough. That's to use an old Aristotelian distinction, that's all about living, but not about living well. And Nietzsche's all about living well. And it may not, the number of people who enjoy that that kind of living well may be quite small. Chen Kai.
It's really interesting to see how you bring those two thinkers together, because they do share lots of similarities, especially how they try to conceive social norm and history in a genealogical manner. And it's more interesting to see how Nietzsche directly speaks about Rousseau in his, I guess it's Gay Science, where he criticizes Rousseau. Like, although Rousseau does a good job, like, conceiving, like, to trace what's the origin of social norms, what's the origin of mankind's history, but he nevertheless tries to understand history from the perspective of contemporary concepts such as freedom and liberty. And something interesting is that Rousseau did a very similar critique on Thomas Hobbes. He says that Hobbes' critique of natural state of mankind was nevertheless conditioned by his knowledge of freedom and liberty, which was the contemporary concepts to Hobbes. So I'm just wondering, how would Rousseau, if he is able to, respond to Nietzsche? Like, would he say, "Oh, you're goddamn right," or he has another reason to back up why he can try to interpret history with the concept of freedom and liberty?
Yeah. Very interesting question. And you're right. In some ways, the history of modern political philosophy is the history of one guy showing how the previous guy got it all wrong. And it goes from Rousseau criticizing Hobbes to Nietzsche criticizing Rousseau to Heidegger criticizing Nietzsche, and it makes it very easy to teach. You can kind of just string the beads along in that way. How would Rousseau respond to Nietzsche? I think, I think that's, I'm not sure I could construct a good response on Rousseau's part. I mean, maybe, insofar as I connect Rousseau to Marx and even to a lot of, contemporary literature in the social justice direction, there are still many who would find this project of making human beings more equal precisely to make them less dependent on one another and to escape in some ways the kind of inauthenticity that belongs to bourgeois life. I think there's, that there are still many people who subscribe. I do think that, and I have to come back to my defense of Nietzsche here a little bit. I do think that Rousseau was writing in such a different world, a world in which democracy was a matter of the future. Rousseau's writing in the midst of a still monarchical Europe and France, and had not really seen what democracy, kind of how it worked out. And I think the story of the 19th century, good part of the story of the 19th century, is thinkers who, experiencing democracy, begin to see that it has some problems. Jean mentioned Tocqueville. Mill would be in that category. Again, Emerson. You could name a ton of 19th century thinkers, all of whom realized that democracy is not necessarily the wonderful thing that it was hoped to be in the 18th century. And therefore, I think it's a little hard to construct an entirely satisfying response on the part of Rousseau, because he hadn't quite experienced the real problems of the very thing for which he was arguing. I saw someone wanted to come up here.
Professor Franco. My name's Kay. I'm taking Professor Yarbroug's class right now, and we've been reading Aristotle's Politics. So speaking of Aristotle, I had a quick question of, I guess, his relation to Nietzsche. You mentioned Nietzsche's views on the unequal nature of human beings and slaves as people who don't belong to themselves. So I was wondering, is that influenced by Aristotle and what he said in the Politics? And also, since the participatory democracy that Rousseau was arguing for was based off of the Greek model, which Nietzsche was disagreeing against,
Yeah.
what would he make of Aristotle's polity?
So, obviously Nietzsche had read Aristotle, and he was a scholar of the Greeks, a very great scholar of Greek antiquity, both the philosophy and the literature. And I think definitely there is a way in which what Nietzsche, what drew him to, this is what drew him to the Greeks was, first of all, this rich culture. Of course, he didn't think it was richest as it was found in Plato and Aristotle, but even before Aristotle and Plato came on the scene, Greek tragedy, pre-Socratic philosophy was in some ways for him the pinnacle of Greek culture. Clearly, he was also drawn and would have been drawn to the hierarchical nature of Aristotle's political thought. Another one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about this comparison between Rousseau and this was just really to repeat your question, they both had an image of the Greeks. They both kind of looked back to the Greeks for inspiration. But as you point out, very different aspects of the Greek experience. For Rousseau, it was the Periclean, Athenian, participatory democracy. And for Nietzsche, it was tragic culture. It was the kind of competition and agonistic nature of Greek culture, where people were constantly trying to surpass one another. That's what kind of interested him. And of course, those two visions lead in absolutely opposite directions. One toward an egalitarian vision of society, and the other in a radically inegalitarian vision of society. But yeah, Nietzsche and Rousseau and their images of Greece would be a book unto itself. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to ask, I guess it is very clear to me how Nietzsche criticizes religion for its attempt to suppress individuality, but he also talks about the purposelessness in the hyper-secular society. I'm just wondering how religion might have influenced Rousseau in forming his ideas, because when you were talking about the impossibility to return to the simple, kind of primitive idea of humanity, it just strikes me as this very almost evangelical language. So I'm just wondering if there's some common ground regarding religion between these two, and what do you think?
So you picked up on something very, I think, important in especially the early Nietzsche versus the later Nietzsche. That in that passage I read from Schopenhauer's Educator, he does talk about, in a almost lamentational way, a kind of nostalgic way, about the way in which life has become, hasty and restless and full of hurry, without contemplation. The waters of religion are ebbing away. Nietzsche's picking up on that kind of regretful tone about the death of God, the loss or decline of religion in the 19th century. Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach is just one of many documents that kind of expresses this sadness that somehow we've lost something great with the decline of religion. And I think this is an important thing to point out with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not your kind of garden variety atheist. He's not there are these new atheists like Dawkins and Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, who are just basically enlightenment types that think science is going to solve everything, and religion was just superstition, and we're best done with it. Nietzsche never had that view of religion. For him, religion is very, very important, and the disappearance of religion is very, very catastrophic. And every presentation of the death of God for Nietzsche is presented in this way that, oh my God, if God is dead, we're up the creek. It's not good. And therefore, this calls forth, now you could, as many 19th century writers did, kind of go back and try to get back to, kind of realizing that this is how bad this is and want to go back. And this is what he criticizes Wagner for in his last work, Parsifal, that in his last work, Wagner kind of lost heart and basically knelt down again before the cross. And Nietzsche thought that was a very cowardly and uncourageous position to take. But in some ways it is understandable given how catastrophic he thought the loss of, or the death of God was. This is why, I'd kind of say this is why Nietzsche's, I'm going to be controversial here, is so much more profound than Marx. Marx is a little bit like that garden variety atheist. He thinks, the death of God is going to lead to, a wonderful humanism of the future. And Nietzsche says, no. Everything in our civilization has rested on this kind of platform. And when it goes, nihilism is at the door. And therefore, we have to think very hard, very long about how to respond to it. And hence the kind of extremity of the response he gives to that situation. Rousseau, but your question was, I wanted to bring that out about, I know. Rousseau, all philosophers are funny on religion. There's not an orthodox one in the bunch, except for maybe Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine. But they're all kind of, even if they're believers, they're funny believers. You never quite know whether they're being serious or not. And that's true of Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau very famously, in the middle of his Emile, has this profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, in which a priest, Rousseau very cunningly does not put the argument in his own voice, but invents this character called the Savoyard vicar to kind of lay out a kind of, quasi-deistic natural theology. And Rousseau did see that as being, his own beliefs are very hard to determine, but Rousseau always felt that religion was an important accompaniment to the moral and political project that he had. And to be honest, Nietzsche did too. Actually, Nietzsche at times does talk about religion serving some utilitarian purposes, especially for the non-elite. So he shares a little bit of that, but doesn't give nearly as much, obviously, credit to religion as Rousseau does. I didn't know whether that was an exit or a question. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Congratulations, first of all. My question is, in Rousseau's view, does democracy necessitate some form of leveling down? I think of this through D'Alembert's letter to the letter to D'Alembert on the theater.
To D'Alembert.
Yes. And it seems that Rousseau would like to block off access to these cultural institutions when these are precisely the cultural institutions that Nietzsche would need to cultivate the overman. Yeah. So are these irreconcilable ideals?
Yeah, so Gabriel refers to, it's actually one of the regrets in the writing of this book that I didn't deal with the question of art in a more sustained way. And again, there's an interesting comparison to be had here. Rousseau wrote a work called The Letter to D'Alembert, in which he talks about, the occasion of the letter was the creation of a theater in Geneva. And Rousseau, always the provocateur, always the iconoclast, again, this is where Nietzsche and Rousseau are very similar. Always the iconoclast said, no, there shouldn't be a theater. A theater would be the worst thing in Geneva. Theaters are things that corrupt the morals of people, that we need good censorship for the kind of democratic polity with the kind of pure mores that he thinks are necessary for a democratic polity. So you couldn't have, in some ways, a sharper contrast with Nietzsche. Nietzsche, for whom, at times, art and creativity seem to be everything. And for Rousseau, who really wants to subordinate art to morality. And this is one of the things that this is part of Nietzsche's criticism of Rousseau. Rousseau is a kind of moral fanatic. He believes that everything is all about morality, and art included is merely subordinated to, creating a simple, robust, democratic populace. And, that just is so, that's an expression of, in some ways, the very opposition between Nietzsche and Rousseau that's at the heart of my book. Really, I think those are great questions. And I really thank you all for being here, for listening, and to so many of you, former students, current students, and faculty, colleagues who have been so wonderful over the years. I just want to say thanks.